New background. What do you think? Impressive, lamb, but that's nothing. Check this out. Let's see Inspiring Philosophy's background. Welcome and welcome back, everybody. My name is Redacted in Several Government Files, and I'm here to talk to you today about where babies come from. Oh, we're saving that one for next time? Okay. Today I'm talking to you about the story of Adam and Eve. More specifically, the story of Adam itself. As we're going to get into, things get real complicated real fast. This video has been a long time in the making for several reasons. For anybody new to the channel, I have training in classical Hebrew, and so when we're looking at stories from the Old Testament, as often as I can, I like to parse them out in their original language and really work through them in the Hebrew itself to see what secrets might be hiding beneath the surface. And surprising probably nobody, the Adam and Eve story has quite a few of those secrets hiding from us from plain sight. So I wanted to make sure I took my time and did the work and worked through the text as well as I could. And I also wanted to consult as many academic resources as I can. This is a very controversial text. It is a text that is very difficult to understand, particularly because there are multiple different interpretation philosophies that can be applied to it. Video for another time. But I still think it's worth digging into this story because for as familiar as it is for many of us, there's still a lot that goes unnoticed in English translations of this text. That's really what I want to bring out to you guys today. Rather than just recording a single giant video on the Adam and Eve story like what I do with the creation story, we're actually going to break this one up into a couple different, hopefully more bite-sized and digestible, shorter videos. The first one here today is we're going to be going through the Adam story itself, more on that in a second here, and looking at all the little details that we can kind of miss if we're just reading through it in an English gloss. In another video I plan on making, we're going to talk about whether the Adam and Eve story should be interpreted as history. For the time being, we're just going to be looking at this story as a story. We sit down and we read the story in books, so what is the meaning that the story is trying to convey to us? So for the purpose of this particular video, I'd like you to suspend your belief or disbelief about whether the events depicted here actually took place in history. That's to say, if you went back in time with a video camera, will you capture exactly what's going on here? Suspend that question from your mind. We're just going to be looking at the story itself and all the narrative beats and motifs that are embedded in this story. Because whether it happened or not, everybody's heard of Adam and Eve, and this story's had a massive impact on pretty much all literature that came out after it. Two more preliminaries to cover before we get started. First of all, the Adam and Eve story that we find it in occurs in three separate but related pericope, or three separate but related episodes, you could say. First, we have the creation of Adam's story. This is followed by the creation of Eve's story, which sort of sit by themselves, even though they're clearly reliant on each other and belong to the same narrative flow. Finally, there's the story of Paradise Lost, which occurs in Genesis 3, a chapter after the creation of Adam and the creation of Eve stories. In another video, I'm going to argue that the creation of Adam's story and the creation of Eve's story, when they were in circulation, knew each other, because each story depends on the other one for its narrative completeness. But the Paradise Lost story, I'm actually going to suggest, was originally unaware of the creation of Adam and Eve's story, or perhaps the other way around. And so it seems that there are multiple Adam and Eve stories in circulation among the ancient Israelites. But again, that's a story for a later time. For right now, we're going to be focusing on specifically the creation of Adam's story. Now again, this story knows the creation of Eve's story, but there's still sort of two separate and somewhat self-contained episodes within a broader narrative framework. So we're just going to be focusing on the creation of Adam's story today, but we are going to be talking about the creation of Eve's story next, and that's going to have some ramifications for this one too. So for right now, we're going to content ourselves with just talking about the creation of Adam. I'm now going to read through the creation of Adam's story itself, stopping short when we move to the creation of Eve's story. Again, I want us to focus on the discrete section that is the creation of Adam, because there's a lot of ideas packed very densely here. The translation is going to be my own. Any mistakes in the translation are therefore wholly my fault. On top of that, there is going to be some discomfort when it comes to some of the tense and aspect of the verbs that are being expressed here. You'll see what I mean when we get to those. I did my best to preserve the original tense and aspect denoted by the verbs in the Hebrew itself. On top of that, I found as I was translating through this that this is an example of what's called heightened prose. Essentially, this is a form of prose that occupies a space between flat, simple prose on one side and poetry on the other. It isn't quite poetry. It doesn't quite fall into the typical Hebrew tropes of poetry that we'd find in, for instance, the book of Job or in the Psalms or in some of the poems embedded in other books of the Bible. And yet it's heightened beyond simple prose, if that makes sense. I think this is going to come out more as I'm talking about it and as you can hear me speak it out loud. But this is an example of what we call heightened prose. So it's about halfway between prose and poetry. Before every shrub of the field was occurring in the ground, before every plant of the field was sprouting, because Yahweh God did not make it rain on earth, Because there was no humanity to work the soil, streams would go up from the earth and water the whole face of the ground. Then Yahweh God created the human, dust from the earth, and he breathed in his nose breath that causes life, and the human became a living creature. And Yahweh God planted an orchard in Eden in the east, and he set there the human which he had made. And Yahweh God made sprout from the earth every tree desirable to see and good to eat, and the tree of life in the midst of the orchard, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And a river went out from Eden to water the orchard, and from there it separated, and it became 4 headwaters. And Yahweh God took the human, and he placed him in the orchard of Eden to work it and to guard it. And Yahweh God commanded the human, saying, You may certainly eat from any tree of the orchard, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you must not eat from it, because when you eat from it you will surely die. Hopefully the heightened prose, as we're calling it, came out in my reading of this text. Again, it isn't quite poetic, it doesn't quite fit into the norms of Hebrew poetry, which are different from English poetry, but it's clearly something more than simply, putting words out there in linear sequence. There's some artistic style that's being deployed here. So first things first, let's talk about the preamble. By the preamble, I'm defining Genesis 2:4b through 6. These are the collection of verses that sort of describe the initial state of creation prior to God's creation of the human being. This material seems boring at first, and in some sense it kind of is. It's just describing the primeval state of creation before God creates the human being, who serves as the main actor for the ensuing 2 chapters. But these verses are actually really important because they help us define what genre of literature we're interacting with here. The way that this material does that is by using multiple tropes used by other literature in the ancient Near Eastern world, which are used to denote that this episode is taking place in what we might call primeval time, sort of the initial stages of the creation of the current order, when the divine realm was essentially washing order over the physical world itself. The world as we know it was under construction in a sense. We have multiple different Mesopotamian examples of using similar language to what we find in Genesis 2:4b through 6 to set up that primeval landscape where the story takes place in. I'm going to read you a couple examples now so you can kind of see what the parallels there are. The Sumerian story of Enki and Ninmah begins as follows. In those days, in the days when heaven and earth were created, in those nights, in the nights when heaven and earth were created, in those years, in the years when the fates were determined, when the Anuna gods were born, when the goddesses were taken in marriage. Another Sumerian story called the Marriage of Martu begins as follows. When the city of Inab already existed, but the city of Kiritab did not exist. When the holy crown already existed, but the holy tiara did not exist. When the holy salt already existed, but the holy alkali did not yet exist. These 2 are examples of a large swath of Sumerian poetry set in the early stages of history, the time when the gods were first inflicting order upon the chaotic realm of human materiality. But these motifs are not only found in Sumerian texts, but also in Akkadian texts written by Babylonian and Assyrians closer to the time of the Old Testament. Here's a couple of examples. The Epic of Atrahasis, written in Akkadian, begins as follows. When the gods were like men, they did forced labor. They bore drudgery. Great indeed was the drudgery of the gods. The forced labor was heavy, the misery too much. The later Babylonian creation story, the Enuma Elish, likewise picks up on this motif and begins as follows. When on high no word was used for heaven, nor below was firm ground called by name, primeval Absu was their progenitor, matrix Tiamat was she who bore them all. When no gods at all had come forth, nor called by names, no destinies ordained, then the gods formed within these 2. You can see the pattern that's being established here. First, it begins with a relative temporal clause. When creation was in such and such states, before the gods, before order, before the nights were decreed, before the heavens were named, things of this nature, sets us in the primeval past. But then there's an action that kickstarts the beginning of the story, whether it's the creation of human beings in the Atrahasis epic or the creation of the cosmic order in the Enuma Elish. Likewise, the story of Adam and Eve follows a very similar train. Remember, the beginning of the Adam and Eve story begins as follows. When Yahweh God made earth and heaven, before every shrub of the field was occurring in the ground, before every plant of the field was sprouting, and so on. But all this setup comes to a head when God creates the human. Then Yahweh God created the human, dust from the earth. And it's the introduction of this human that begins the agent who's kind of the primary actor on the stage that's been established. We know we're in primeval time. We know we're at sort of the beginning of the story, if you will. There's important decisions being made that are going to affect creation forever after this point. And introducing the human in this way is sort of the means of like, okay, we've got the setup, enter main character onto the narrative here. Now, I should note that just because the Adam and Eve story uses this motif of sort of starting with a relative temporal clause to situate the story in primeval history following conventions found in Sumerian and Akkadian literature, this doesn't necessarily mean that the Adam and Eve story was following one of those stories closely or even copying from it. It seems that this was a common motif adopted by multiple different authors in the ancient world to tell the audience, hey, this is what's going on in ancient history. The authors of the Adam and Eve story were people who read. They knew these motifs, and they knew that their audience would recognize these motifs as well. So it doesn't seem that the Adam and Eve story is directly borrowing from one of these examples or another, much less any of those examples borrowing from each other either. Rather, this is the way that ancient authors in the broader culture introduced primeval stories. As I mentioned in the Genesis 1 video, there's a very good chance that the Genesis 1 story also begins with a relative temporal clause. I ultimately sided against taking that perspective in favor of an alternative in that video, but I did warn you that I was probably going to change my mind, and in fact I have, after doing more research on how primeval stories were introduced, and seeing it happen again in the same book. The book of Genesis does this again with the Adam and Eve story, which I think is particularly fascinating. So the Adam and Eve story is using a motif from the ancient world without necessarily borrowing it from a particular ancient source document. Of course, that's always possible, but as we'll get into later, it seems unlikely that we have direct borrowing or direct adoption of a particular story from ancient Mesopotamia, although the authors were likely aware of literature such as that. So the story begins properly in Genesis 2:4b, with the first statement being, when Yahweh God created earth and heaven. Stop right there. This is actually a really interesting point, because the title used for God in the Adam and Eve story is Yahweh God, or Yahweh Elohim. This is really peculiar because Yahweh and Elohim are both terms used to refer to God in the Old Testament. Yahweh is generally seen as God's proper name. When he introduces himself to Moses and the Israelites, he says, my name is Yahweh. Your ancestors worshipped me as El, or God, but I'm telling you my proper name, and my proper name is Yahweh. Elohim, on the other hand, was a general term for deities or spirits. It could be used for Yahweh. Yahweh is referred to as Elohim in Israelite sources, but it's sort of the generic word for God. Kind of like how we use the term God to refer, typically in Christian circles, to the Christian God, the Father of Jesus. At the same time, when we talk about Greek gods, we're using the term sort of generically. And the ancients used this with Elohim as well. Elohim, the Elohim, one might say, refers to the God of Israel in the context of Israelite usage of the term. But you could refer to the Elohim of the nations, and that refers to the various gods of the nations. You could even use Elohim to refer to non-deific spirits. For instance, when the spirit of the prophet Samuel is called forth by a necromancer in the book of Samuel, it says that the Elohim of Samuel rises up, suggesting that human spirits can also be called Elohim. So the term Elohim is a generic sort of catch-all term for God or deity or ghost or spirit of sorts, but it does get used a lot in the Old Testament to refer to God. Other parts of the Old Testament still call God by his proper name, Yahweh. And the reason for this disparity is really interesting. In some circles, especially getting into the Second Temple period, using the proper name of Yahweh became impolite, or at the very least taboo. And the reason for that is because there are laws in the Ten Commandments and elsewhere saying that you are not to take the name of the Lord your God in vain. This is a very serious offense which could result in somebody being cut off from the community covenant of the ancient Israelites itself. Total separation not only from your family, but from your deity as well. And so to avoid accidentally misusing the name of God, the Israelites ceased pronouncing it. They would pronounce Elohim or an alternative word, Adonai, instead, so that they wouldn't abuse the proper name of God. But again, this wasn't universal. We do have plenty of documents that still use the divine name, and it's not until a long time after this that we start to see the taboo around pronouncing God's name really take hold, well into the Hellenistic period from what I've seen. So why is God called Yahweh Elohim here, and why is it such a big deal? Isn't this just calling him Yahweh God? Well, yes it is, but it's peculiar that every single time the name of God occurs in the Adam and Eve story, it's always Yahweh Elohim. This is particularly weird because after the Adam and Eve story, it's typically either Yahweh or Elohim, and before the Adam and Eve story, it's just Elohim. If you read the Genesis 1 creation story, it is Elohim every single time. And the reason that this is the case, scholars believe, is because the book of Genesis as we have it, and I promise I'm going to make a full video on this, isn't the product of a single author who sat down and wrote the whole thing out in an afternoon, or even over the course of years. It's a composite of multiple different scholarly documents being put together, different stories written by different authors at different time periods in Israel's history. So the author of Genesis 1 lived in a time when they preferred to say Elohim instead of the proper name Yahweh. They're still referring to Yahweh, but they want to call him God, Elohim, to reduce the chances potentially of misusing his name. The Adam and Eve author, on the other hand, uses the name Yahweh pretty consistently, and for other stories as well, like stories about Abraham and Joseph and so on, because they lived in a time when it was okay to say the name still. It hadn't become taboo yet. And so when you combine this older document that's comfortable saying the name, and this newer document which is uncomfortable saying the name, and you piece them together, you need to let the audience know that the Elohim you're talking about in one story and the Yahweh you're talking about in another story refer to the same deity. So the author of Genesis, or the editor of Genesis, who's putting all of these stories together, faced a choice. The first chapter of Genesis, the creation story that we talked about, only uses the word Elohim. But in the Adam and Eve story, the name Yahweh shows up all the time. How do you ensure that the audience knows that Yahweh and Elohim are the same deity? By calling him Yahweh Elohim in the first story where that occurs. That way the impression is set in the audience's mind that Yahweh and Elohim are the same deity. So essentially the editor of Genesis was putting the pieces together, putting the stories together in this collection, and they found the first story refers to God exclusively by Elohim. The next story refers to God exclusively by Yahweh. So to make sure that the audience isn't confused, in that first story where the two of them meet, the author names the deity Yahweh Elohim. That way the audience knows in every ensuing story that Yahweh and Elohim are the same. And in case anybody thinks that this is too extreme or just making a mountain out of a molehill, consider that in the entire rest of the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the collocation Yahweh Elohim occurs otherwise only on one occasion. Now let's talk about Adam, or as I've chosen to translate it, the human. You'll notice that in my translation of this story, I didn't use the name Adam once. And no, Adam doesn't receive that name at a later time. The text does refer to him as Adam. But I've chosen not to translate this as Adam for a very particular reason. The reason I chose not to translate the word Adam as the proper name Adam that a lot of us are very used to is because the Hebrew word Adam isn't a proper name. It's the Hebrew word that means humankind. We find this word popping up all over in the Old Testament, and on every occasion it refers to humanity in a collective sense, or a large group of people in a collective sense. One of the other reasons that we know that Adam, or humankind, isn't a proper name in this story is because after its first occurrence, every single time this word shows up in Genesis 2, it has what's called a definite article prefixed to it. The definite article, ha, is the Hebrew word the. And just like in modern English, we don't see the word the placed before proper names in the Hebrew Bible. We never see the Moses, or the David, or the Nebuchadnezzar. The word the, or ha in Hebrew, never occurs before proper names. And yet it does occur here before Adam. So instead of having ha-Adam be the Adam, referring to a dude named Adam, what we probably have here is the human, something of that nature. And this human, again, is archetypally representing all of humankind. So what gives? Are we talking about a single person here, or are we talking about a collection of people here? Well, the text clearly has us understand that there's one human being walking around doing all of these things. It's a marvel when another human being shows up later, which is the topic of the next narrative video. So why is the human being in this story named humankind? This is a very complicated discussion, and I want to talk about it more when we talk about Is the Adam and Eve story history, which is going to be a separate video to prevent us from being derailed. For the purposes of our literary analysis of this, it seems clear that the author of this story wants us to understand Adam, or the human being, as something of an archetype for humankind. In other words, you can talk about the figure, the character called Adam, or humankind, and it says something about humanity as a whole as we encounter it. This is actually a familiar trope that we find in the Hebrew Bible a lot. It's very common to come across characters in the oldest chapters of the Bible who bear the names of nation states that the Israelites ran into at a later time. For instance, Esau, the brother of Jacob, who was tricked out of his inheritance and his blessing, was also called Edom, and he was seen as the father of the Edomites, who are a people who lived to the southeast of the ancient Israelite kingdom. And so to depict Esau as the father of the Edomites means that you can say something about the Edomites while portraying them through the character that's sort of the ancestor of them all. Esau is an archetype for the Edomites. We see this elsewhere in the story of Ammon and Moab, who are two characters in the Bible who are born out of horrific circumstances that I'm not going to get into here because probably the video would get taken down, although we'll talk about that story eventually, and I'm afraid. But Ammon and Moab are born in a very, very unconventional manner, and this is a way of commenting on the Moabites and the Ammonites, people who share name with those archetypal characters. So by the Israelites saying that Moab and Ammon were born in this very rude and crude circumstance is a comment on the Ammonites and the Moabites themselves, who the Israelite readers of this story were dealing with and encountering on an almost daily basis here. Talking about one character who bears the name of a nation or a population allows you to associate sort of stereotypes and ideas with an entire people group depicted through a narrative containing one person. It would be like if I wrote a story where a character named America, what's stereotypical about America? He wakes up and he eats bacon and whiskey for breakfast before taking his AR-15 down to the gun store to buy guns with stuff, driving his truck down the street at an outrageous mile per hour, measured in anything but the kilometer, brother. You get the idea. Maybe he runs into a guy named Britain at a later time who's sipping tea and talking about how he used to be a real big shot, but now he's, just kind of sitting by himself, isolated from everybody else except for his cousin that he can't get rid of, who's kind of like over there, but not far enough over there to the point where it's separate. And also, Scotland, somehow. You kind of get what I'm getting at here. It's a way of stereotyping an entire people group or even an entire nation into a single character, and then making comments about that character adds to the stereotypes about those people groups. This can be done in either positive or negative ways. Of course, the characters of Ammon and Moab that we come across at a later time are negatively characterized. The circumstances of their birth are horrific, and so this sort of says something about the Ammonites and the Moabites. But it can be positive as well, as we'll see a couple examples of that coming down the road. So, since we have the idea of sort of stereotyping an entire population by a single character, Adam seems to be the ultimate stereotype, because Adam means humankind. So when Adam, the character, the human, is walking around the garden doing these things, it's making comments about humanity as a whole, universal humankind. And this fits pretty well with where we find this story in Genesis. It's right at the beginning. We're going to see a lot of other archetypal figures or sort of tribal archetypal figures come down the line, and that makes sense as the story progresses and as humankind rolls out. But here at the beginning, with the first human being ever on the stage, it makes sense for that human being to be archetypally named Adam. Clear as mud? Good. Let's talk about mud. So when God decides to create Adam, humanity, or the human being, and remember we're still talking about a single human actor on the stage, if you will. The author and the audience of Genesis 2 would imagine a single character that's being played out in this way, although that character is representative of humankind as a whole. So when we see Adam, or the human, appear on stage, God decides to create the human out of dust. Now, this is a very important thing to notice for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's wordplay going on here. It says that Yahweh God creates the human out of the dust of the earth. The term translated earth here is Adamah. Adam created from Adamah, which is a very fun and cute little wordplay going on there. It's also very important, and we're going to see it come up at a later time, the relationship between Adam, humanity, and Adamah, the soil, specifically as an agricultural producer, is going to come up a lot in the course of the Genesis stories. It's going to show up in the Noah story, the Cain and Abel story. We're going to see it down the line with Abraham as well. So just kind of tuck that in the back of your mind. But remember, Adam, humanity, created from Adamah, soil. And frequently we see depictions of Adam, or humanity, being created out of the soil in the sense of like clay, and that kind of makes sense, because we have the idea of a potter molding clay, which is imagery that the Bible itself uses a lot to depict sort of the creation of Adam, or the creation of humanity in this sense. We get the idea of God molding clay into a human form, and then later on, as we'll see, breathing life into it so it becomes a living thing. But the particular word used here in the Hebrew is afar, which is the Hebrew word referring to dust. Now, why is dust important? The material that a thing is made out of, or in this case a person or humankind is made out of, says something about the thing itself. For me to say that my cat is made out of love, I'm not telling you what the chemical composition of the cat is. I'm telling you something about the cat itself. No, I don't have a cat yet, but that's going to change very soon. So to say that Adam, or to say that humankind is made out of dust, says something about the composition, the character of humankind itself. We're not talking about chemistry or biology here. The Israelites didn't have microscopes. They're saying something about the essence of Adam, the essence of humanity, by saying that Adam, or humankind, is made out of dust. So why dust specifically? What does dust symbolize in the sense that humankind is made out of it? What's the importance of dust specifically as opposed to clay or dirt or any other sort of, terrestrial detritus? The answer seems pretty straightforward. You're going to die. And so am I. Dust is frequently associated with the realm of the dead in ancient Israelite literature and in other ancient Near Eastern literature as well. In fact, the domain of the dead is sometimes called the dusty place, or the place of dust. When a person dies in the Old Testament, we also see the living relatives of that person put on sackcloth and ashes. The idea here seems to be sort of participating in the death of that person by putting on a funeral shroud and the dust of death on themselves, weeping for the person who's actually departed to the dusty place, the realm of the dead itself. So for God to make the archetypal human, the Adam, the humankind, out of dust suggests that humankind is intrinsically mortal. We're intrinsically perishable. We're something that, without help, is going to die eventually. This is an apparent reality that's apparent to all humankind. So it's sort of appropriate that the one universal thing about humanity is that we're made from a perishable substance. But dust isn't the only component to the archetypal human. After molding the physical form of Adam, or the human, God breathes the breath of life into his lungs and he becomes a living creature, a nefesh chaya. Now, this verse is really important because some older translations read this as, and the human being, and Adam, became a living soul. And a lot of people see here sort of a duality between the physical component of humankind and the spiritual component of humankind. It was very common for the ancient church fathers to depict this as the situation where God forms the human body out of physical matter, and then he breathes in the spirit or the soul to that human creature. So we have substance dualism, a creature formed from dust of the earth, but also the spirit which comes from the divine realm. This is the way that people read the story for a long time, especially in early Christian circles. But this doesn't seem to be exactly what the Hebrew text has in mind here. The ancient Israelites didn't really have a concept of a soul in the same sense that we do, or that the ancient Christian church fathers did. Rather, they seem to conceptualize the human being as a whole person, body and mental faculties all sort of wrapped up in one. While they did conceptualize some part of the human being surviving after death, they didn't have a very well-established or well-thought-through concept of soul, punishment, eternal afterlife, and heaven or hell. Go see my Cult of the Dead video on that if you're interested in the topic more. But it would be a mistake to read ideas of soul and immortality into the text that aren't there. What the text seems to be indicating by saying that God breathed the breath of life into Adam and he became a living creature is that Adam became alive in that moment. The human being became active and living. And the term, he became a living creature, is used later to refer to the creation of animals as well. So this doesn't seem to refer to a specific rational soul that the human being specifically has that all creatures don't. It seems to just refer to the fact that the creature is now animate. After the human being is made, God takes the human being and he places him in the orchard in Eden that he planted there. Again, I'm translating the word for garden as orchard since it says in verse 10 that God specifically caused trees to grow in that area, specifically fruit trees, but garden is the traditional translation and it certainly is allowable. What's important is that when God places the human being in the Garden of Eden or in the Orchard of Eden, he gives him particular functions. That's to say, it says that God placed the human being in the Orchard of Eden to work it and to keep it, or to work it and to guard it, depending on how you want to translate that. This is actually really important because here the author of this story is expressing to us what the purpose of humanity is in the eyes of the author itself. So essentially, humankind is depicted here as being an agricultural agent. Humankind is meant to work the earth and to keep it. Humankind is essentially an agricultural creature. And this is a motif that we see a lot in other Mesopotamian and ancient Near Eastern material as well, like in the Atrahasis epic and in the Enuma Elish. there's an intrinsic connection between humankind and the process of agriculture. And this makes a lot of sense, because for human civilization to flourish, you need agriculture. Cities can only be built by agricultural civilizations, because if you're wandering around following food, whether it be tame herds or wild animals that you're hunting and gathering from, you can't stay in one place for too long. So every civilization that reaches a point where it starts building permanent structures, cities with walls and governments and things of that nature, you need a constant source of food that's not going to go anywhere. And that's what agriculture is. So the story here represents humankind as a fundamentally urban and agrarian culture. Contradictory though those may seem, they actually go hand in hand. You need agriculture to build urban civilization. So humankind, functioning in its social sense, is fundamentally agricultural. We need agricultural. We rely on agriculture. And so this story represents humankind as an agricultural being. Humankind's function is to keep and to work the earth. And this goes back to that wordplay I identified earlier with Adam, the word for humankind, being taken from Adamah, which means soil or earth. So the human and soil connection is being played out in more detail here. It was sort of foreshadowed by saying Adam was taken from Adamah, humankind was taken from the soil, but now we see that the function of humankind in the story is to work the soil and to keep it, probably in an agrarian method. I should note that some scholars, like my teacher John Walton, have identified some potentially priestly undercurrents to this as well. There are other references to using the words for work and keep in priestly senses, and it was very common for ancient temple structures to have gardens adjacent to them. So some understand Adam here as playing sort of a priestly role. He's sort of the priestly caretaker of the royal, or in this case divine, grounds of the temple itself. Sort of the outer gardens of the temple are the responsibility of this priestly creature that Adam is created to be. And that being said, while I acknowledge that such priestly undertones might be there, I've actually wound up favoring a purely agricultural approach to this. And the primary reason for that is because this language of working and keeping is used almost verbatim in the Cain and Abel story, which takes place after the Adam and Eve story, written by the same author, to refer to Cain's practice of working and keeping the earth. It seems to have a purely agricultural understanding there, but it's entirely possible that there are some priestly undertones here. I wouldn't necessarily deny it, but I don't necessarily see it. It seems primarily agricultural in this story. And then in verses 16 and 17, we get the dramatic foreshadowing. God tells the human being that he can eat from any tree in the orchard, except for one, the one in the middle of the orchard. He can't eat from that one. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is forbidden to him. This is some really cool foreshadowing, because in between the first mention of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the prohibition for Adam to eat from it, from the human to eat from it, and the time that we actually see the whole drama regarding that tree take place, they don't happen concurrently with each other. We have the interruption with the creation of Eve, which we're going to talk about next time here. So we're sort of setting up a story plot element that isn't really going to come into play for a little while yet. So it's really cool. And this is where I think we should call it on the creation of Adam story, because I want to talk more about the Paradise Lost story in its own time. So I really hope everybody enjoyed that analysis of the creation of Adam story. The next couple of videos, I'm not sure which order I'm going to do them on. I'm going to start talking about the creation of Eve story, since that takes place immediately after the creation of Adam story. And yes, there's a lot more equally cool and weird stuff hiding in that story as well. I'm also going to talk about whether we should view this story historically or not, or even whether it was meant to be taken historically or not, as this is a very dense conversation that's been going on for a very long time, and it's very easy to get lost in the course of that conversation. So I'm doing my homework, making sure I represent it right, but at the same time, I think I have some really interesting and important things to say. So I hope everybody had a really good time with this. Please let me know if there's anything I missed or any questions that come up from this. But I hope everybody has a fantastic day. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon. What is up with the lighting? Jeez. I think I accidentally hit the rave button. I'm not sure how. I feel like one of those birds